I'm Maria McFarland Sanchez Moreno, and I'm the CEO at Represent Us. I have spent my career working on issues of autocracy and corruption around the world and in the US. I lived in a country that was led by a corrupt autocrat in Peru under President Fujimori in the 1990s. And I know how this happens. I know how a democratically elected leader can eventually corrupt and destroy democracy from within. So often you have a democratically elected leader, maybe somebody who's even very popular, who starts taking over the other branches of government and eliminating checks on their authority. So in Peru, where I lived, Fujimori used money to buy off people in the opposition, and he also intimidated people who might stand up against him or removed them. So, for example, when justices on the Constitutional Court ruled that he couldn't run for a third term, he just removed the ones who voted against him. And we've seen that pattern in other places as well. The way coups happen nowadays is usually not through the military showing up at the presidential palace and killing a bunch of people and taking over. It's often people who are already in government who break the existing constitutional system, the system of checks and balances that allow democracy to continue and that allow different voices to be heard. They break that and they take power for themselves. Attacks on democracy often go hand in hand with a massive increase in corruption. So I've seen how leaders sometimes take over by saying they're going to fight corruption, right? They say that, oh, the system is so corrupt, I need to come in and fix it all. The problem is that often those leaders come in and they break the system not to clean up corruption, but to bring their own type of corruption in. So you'll have these networks of powerful people who surround the leader and support that person as they then start ignoring laws, start ignoring the courts, start doing things that eliminate checks on them. For example, getting rid of oversight bodies, getting rid of systems to provide information to the public so that they can increase the secrecy of what they do. And then they start sharing the wealth and the benefits of being in power with their network. So you see this in other countries. You see this in Guatemala, for example, where right now there is a president who incredibly was able to win office democratically after many years of what was known as the Pact of the Corrupt, being in power and using their power, both inside and outside of government, with the private sector, to intimidate everybody else and line their pockets with the people's money. You see this over and over again, and you see very concrete consequences of that. Corruption, in the end, ends up harming lots and lots of people. So when you have a system where the people in charge aren't accountable to anybody, where they just get to do what they want, you start seeing all sorts of effects on ordinary people. So in Turkey, you've had this autocrat in power for many years, and a few years ago, when there was a massive earthquake that hit the country, tens of thousands of people died. Why? Because the buildings had been constructed with poor materials, and the regulations that should have been enforced to protect people, to ensure that those buildings were safe, were not being enforced due to corruption, in part due to this autocratic government. Another example is Lebanon. In Lebanon, there was this enormous explosion in the port of Beirut a few years ago. And a major factor driving that explosion and the lack of accountability for it afterwards is just the fact that the whole system has been captured by a very small elite group who can never be held accountable for what they do. And they just do whatever they want, and the people suffer. In Guatemala, you've seen terrible problems in the healthcare system and massive poverty. And again, this is happening in part because the country was for a very long time, and in many ways still is, under the influence of this Pact of the Corrupt, who basically use resources of the country to enrich themselves while starving everyone else. Well, I'm very concerned about what I'm seeing happen in the United States right now. President Trump was clearly democratically elected. However, any president needs to comply with the rule of law, needs to obey the Constitution, needs to respect the other branches of government. And what we have seen in just a few weeks is sustained effort to break with separation of powers, checks and balances, norms that are at the heart of American democratic ideals. So, for example, one of the first things President Trump has done is go into the Department of Justice and start sacking people who investigated him or investigated the January 6th riots. Another thing that he did was pardon even the most violent people who participated in the January 6 events. That sends a strong message that anybody who stands up with President Trump and even engages in violence on his behalf is going to get away with it. It's an incredibly dangerous message, and it's very intimidating to other people. President Trump has sought to punish people who stood up to him in any way. That includes Republicans in Congress who have been primaried and who, in some cases, may be afraid of speaking out. We are seeing other efforts to remove checks on power, like President Trump's removal of 17 inspectors general in different agencies, which sets the stage for massive corruption in those agencies, which are now being led often by people from the sectors themselves that should be regulated. So people who have personal business interests in the areas that those agencies should be overseeing. And now there won't be independent inspectors general who will be able to hold them to account. We're also seeing this purge of law enforcement in the FBI, who would be the ones in charge of investigating abuse and corruption in the federal government. And meanwhile, we see the president empowering Elon Musk to go throughout the government and doing all sorts of things that appear to be illegal. And now that those actions are being challenged in court, we're seeing Musk kind of suggest, well, maybe we wouldn't even have to follow those court orders. Maybe we should challenge these rulings and not obey. And the thing is, our system depends on the president, Congress, and the courts committing to follow the law. When one of those actors decides not to do that, there needs to be a consequence. But now, with President Trump controlling DOJ and the FBI, if he decides to flout a court order, it is not clear who would enforce that against him. So him choosing to disobey the courts is a way of breaking the system. It is effectively a coup from within.